Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is exploring primary performance data in 2023. A couple of housekeeping points just before we start, if we may. If I could ask you to ensure that your microphones are muted. We do have a question and answer facility. The panel is there, so if you have any questions, please do type them into the panel and hit submit, and I will do my level best to be able to respond to them as we go through the session this morning. Just so that you're aware, today's webinar is being supported by Smoothwall, who are one of Governance for Schools' key partners. And this is just a message from our sponsors who are involved in one of the key aspects of governance this year in terms of change and safeguarding responsibilities. They are providers of monitoring and filtering software. Sorry, I lost the word I was looking for then. Monitoring and filtering software for schools, and you can use that QR code, or which will take you directly to their website to find out more about them if you'd like to do so. By way of introduction, my name is Steve Barker. I'm here from Better Governor, and we're delighted as ever to be working with Governors for Schools this morning to bring today's webinar to you. It is your webinar, so please, if you have any questions or comments, send them across. I'll do my level best to keep up with them, and if I can't answer them during the session, I will get back to you afterwards. So in terms of the aims of this morning's session, what we're going to try and cover this morning is first and foremost to explore what and how pupil performance data for primary schools specifically is going to be published in 2023. Sorry, I can see there's a space missing on that first aim there. I do apologise. Then we'll think about how we can clarify how primary school data is viewed by Ofsted, local authority, other people, etc. But also, more importantly, I would suggest how it should be considered by us as individual governors, but also in our governing bodies, whether that's at a full governing body session or at a committee. And as we go through, what we try and do is always think about the central role of governors, which is about establishing that strategic overview. So what we want to do this morning is actually reflect on how governors should ensure that their scrutiny of data and the school's scrutiny, but hopefully use of data, informs the strategic overview that we have of our individual schools and trusts. So I wanted to start off just really by thinking about what do we mean by performance data? Comes in a whole variety of forms and sizes, but as governors, what's our take on performance data? And what I've shared with you on this slide that's just popped up in that pink box at the bottom there is a definition that's used by the Department for Education that you can find on the .gov.uk website. And you can see here, it actually says that the performance data is defined as data that measures the achievements of pupils in each state-funded primary school in England. State-funded is important. That means academies as well as maintained schools, of course. And all of the data that is actually there is available to everybody, irrespective of whether you're in the academy sector or in the maintained sector. So if we think about what data is out there, and there is quite a lot of data, I think what I want to do, make you aware of this morning, is not all of it is data that we have to rely on our schools to share with us. The individual school data, of course, at school level, and that we can actually drill down into groups of pupils, etc. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Some of that is available to all of us, but a lot of it is what we should be relying on our schools to share with us. But one of the most important aspects of data access comes from a website which is rather unimaginatively called Find and Check the Performance of Schools and Colleges in England. Apologies to those colleagues in Wales joining us this morning. I don't know whether Wales has a similar website, I'm afraid, but this only covers schools in England. But I do believe if there is because the Scottish one is actually very similar, I'm assuming the Welsh one would be as well. And this is a site that is accessible. Our focus this morning is on primary data. Secondary data normally comes on a slightly longer timescale, but again, secondary schools are featured on this site as well. And We also have what are called primary school performance tables. This is national data. It's produced by the National Statistics Office and is actually shared again on the .gov.uk website. But of course, a really good start point for all of us is to actually look at our school's own website. Is it a requirement for both academies and for maintained schools across all phases of education to publish their latest data? I just happened to pick this school, Thorpe C of E School. It's near where I live in Surrey, and I actually did a whole governing body training session there on Tuesday evening this week. So I was looking at their website in advance of delivering the training, and I saw that they've already published their 2023 Key Stage 2 data. So have a look at your own school's website, because that will tell you a lot about the data. And I can see there's a question on the panel come in from Carol, who is actually saying, what's the difference between achievement and attainment? That's a good question, Carol. Attainment, first of all, if I may, attainment is scores that children and young people get in tests, GCSEs, A-levels, etc. So normally the marks they get, the grades, that's attainment. That's what they have attained, the level that they've actually reached. Achievement tends to be looking at that attainment and then measuring how much progress that has been from the start point. So if you're talking about end of Key Stage 2 SATs that children sit when they're in Year 6 prior to going off to secondary school, you would then measure the progress that their SATs results actually represent by going back and looking to what their Key Stage 1 prior attainment was. And I can see that Chris has actually put a question, is this just for primary schools? Yes, the intention is that this is aimed at primary schools because we don't have secondary data available yet, Chris. But a lot of the principles, a lot of the ways in which we're looking at this are very, very similar. And then just wanted to actually drill down a little bit on the support guidance that's out there. This document that's actually showing up on the left-hand side of your screen at the moment, again, rather unimaginatively titled document, Primary School Accountability in 2023 Technical Guide. Technical guide. Now, you may think that this is probably not something that as governors that we would necessarily want to delve into. I would be inclined to agree with you, but it does help because it actually tells you a lot about the way in which the government are actually going to be presenting data this year. It has to be said there aren't any significant changes from the way it was done in 2019 when it was last presented. But the key here is that it is this month, it's December, when we're actually going to be seeing that data, as you can see by that second line there. And we had an announcement yesterday morning, Monday morning rather, that for the 14th of December, so next Thursday, just before the end of term for an awful lot of schools, of course, is the date when that date is going to be published. They even said it will be published at 9:30 in the morning. So something to look out for, but also something to think about because it's so close to the end of term, it's unlikely governors are going to see that until the spring term. But so what we're going to do this morning is actually look at the data that is out there at the moment and how that should inform discussions, how it should inform agendas in our governing board meetings. What I've got on this slide in front of you now is the national data. You'll see it relates to 2022. This particular slide won't be updated until the 14th of December, as I've just said, but the data will be presented, we're led to understand at this stage, in an identical format as it is here. So what the government refer to, or what the DfE refers to as headline facts and figures, here relate to the academic year that finished in July 2022. And you've got these 6 main headline figures here. Sorry, excuse me. Which relate to what the government determines to be the 6 key aspects that we should be reporting on. The first one, and again, these are all related to primary schools here, the percentage of pupils meeting the expected standard in the combined score of, the combined measure of reading, writing, and maths. So the 3 subjects that children actually sit SATs in at the end of Key Stage 2, their combined attainment was 59% last year, which is a big bold figure. And you can see underneath that the government is actually giving you what the equivalent figure was back in 2019. And of course, don't forget the reason why we're using 2019 is because we had that 3-year hiatus where no primary data was actually published at all. So slightly down on the 2019 figure. But of course, what we have to bear in mind when we're comparing year on year, we're not talking about the same children. We're talking about a completely different cohort of children and young people. And therefore, we need to make comparisons in a very guarded way, I would suggest. The second box, the percentage of pupils reaching the higher standard. So if we think about that 59%, that's the combined figure for English, maths, for reading, writing and maths, of youngsters, children who reach the age-related expectation, often referred to as ARE or R. ARE, age-related expectation, that's where the government establishes that children should be in their learning in comparison to the national curriculum at the end of year 6, end of Key Stage 2. Children reaching a level which is 10% higher than that are described as reaching the higher standard. And again, you have a higher standard in all 3 of those core subjects, reading, writing and maths, 7% last year, 11% in 2019. The disadvantage gap index relates to disadvantaged pupils, and that's on the far right on the top row there. Disadvantaged pupils defined by the government as those attracting pupil premium for the schools. And what this is, it's an index, so it's looking at the proportion of children at the end of Key Stage 2 who are disadvantaged and comparing the gap between their performance and the performance of all other non-disadvantaged pupils. And you can see, unsurprisingly, because of everything that we know about what happened in the height of the pandemic, that performance indicator gap has actually widened. It had got down to 2.9 in 2019 after many years of hard work on the part of schools. The schools saw big issues with regards to attendance and a whole host of other factors impacting on that in the 12 months running up to last year's SATS tests, and that's reflected in those results there. And then on the bottom row, you've got, let's say, combined figure on the top row, top left, but on the bottom row, you've got these scores for individual subjects of reading, writing, and maths. And on the writing one in the middle, just to point out, it says writing TA. TA means teacher assessment. The reading and the reading and the maths papers go off to be externally marked. The writing papers are actually marked by the school, so they're assessed internally by teachers. And you can see the scores there. I don't need to actually insult your intelligence by reading them out for you. You can read them yourselves. But a few ups and downs there. Reading better than 2019, 75 versus 73. Writing, quite a big drop. And again, that's something, if we think about it, writing is a higher order skill, certainly. And a lot of schools have reported that children struggled being able to have support for writing when they were working remotely. Lots of things like stamina being issues when children return to school. And writing is one of the real casualties of that, I think it's fair to say. Question on the panel from Peter. Peter saying, does the definition of expected standard change over the years? If so, is it possible to see how it's changed? There's a very complex way of actually calculating it. They have standardized scores, Peter. It doesn't change that much. It's administered by an expert panel, which is comprised of teachers, and they look at the questions each year and then decide where the pass mark is going to be. But in reality, the age-related expectation is about what children know in relation to the national curriculum. So the papers are designed to actually test that level of knowledge. And I can see we've got another question on the panel here from Anne, and Anne is saying, do the headlines report attendance? No, they don't, Anne, but that is reported on a different part of the website. And again, that's public domain as well. But performance data is treated totally separately. Jackie is saying, why are the individual scores so much higher than the combined? Or maybe I need a maths lesson. I wouldn't dream of suggesting that, Jackie. But the combined score is you have to have all three. So it may well be, so for example, if you look at the maths score of 71%, clearly 71% of all pupils got maths, but they didn't all get reading and writing at the expected level. And there will always be some variation there. So that is a tricky one to actually think about. Mary is saying, is higher standard the same as greater depth? Yes, absolutely it is. And at that stage, we will actually move on. Sorry, this was a bit of a messy slide. I don't know what's happened with my formatting here. But in terms of the data that we do have that's available to us at the moment, and bearing in mind we're waiting for this year's data, so a lot of the published data we've got at the moment does actually relate to 2019 data. That's better. Sorry, that's my correct slide. I'm not sure what's happening there. So we're going to focus on that find and check performance of schools and colleges in England. And if we open up that particular website, and I've given you the URLs or the links for these sites on the penultimate slide, and you will get the slides sent to you after the event. You have this little box down in the bottom corner here, in the bottom left-hand corner, I should say, which I'm just putting a green highlighter around now. And it enables you to search for a school or college or a multi-academy trust, either by name, by location, by local authority. I'm not quite sure why, but other than MPs, I'm not sure who'd actually want to search by parliamentary constituency, but that's there too. Most people want to go in and either look at their own school or look at schools that they know of, usually in fairly close proximity to their own. So a lot of people would be choosing by name, which is that first box, but you just tick that box and then click away. I have at random picked a school, which I believe is actually, this is in Barking and Dagenham. Yes, it says Wood Lane, Dagenham. This is public domain. I'm not sharing any confidential information with you at all here. Any one of you can actually look at the data for any school in England by putting the name in that chart. Once you find the school, their page opens up. It looks exactly like this. You will see in that grey bounded box at the bottom there where it says primary, that confirmation that there was no test data for the last 3 years, and the 2023 data will be the first time. And again, that reminder that it's December. We now know it's next Thursday, December 14th. But you can still go on and look at the 2019 data. And I think what we're going to do this morning is look at that. Obviously, not spend a huge amount of time analysing the data because it's 4 years old, but just so that you know what to expect when this year's data comes out. So you've got the view box there. I've already put that little green highlighter on it. So if we click on that, you get a breakdown of top line data. Now you'll see there's a similar format here as when we were looking at the national data earlier. It's looking at reading, writing, and maths. They're the subjects for children sit SATs in. And what it's doing here is actually also giving you an indicator of which band this school for each of these subjects falls into in terms of its overall performance in comparison with all other schools nationally. And you can see reading, the school is broadly average, similarly with writing, but in maths it's actually above average. And again, if you think back to some of the data that you'll have in your school, maths is one of those subjects that in a lot of schools has fared very well in the pandemic years because it's a lot easier, many teachers anecdotally feedback, to teach remotely than perhaps some of the more creative subjects. But nonetheless, this is 2019 data that we're looking at here, so don't read anything too significant to that. The important thing is how this is laid out. So it'll tell you which band your school falls into. It'll tell you your score, and the score here is a deviation score. So it's a representation of how far away you are from the score of 1 which is the average. So if you remember, 1 is the midpoint on what Americans call a bell curve or a normal distribution curve. And if you've got a minus score, you're slightly to the left of that, in other words, below average. If you've got a positive score, you're slightly above that, above average. John's asking a question: how reliable is percentage data for schools with small cohorts? Good point, John. It's not as reliable, obviously, but of course, when we're talking about national data, there's a vast database there. So usually, and again, there are reports out there. I think there's something called the Inspection Data Summary Report that will not report on very small cohorts because it doesn't consider them to be statistically significant. So I think we have to bear in mind the size of the cohort, and if you are a governor in a small school, then clearly those nuances of data are quite difficult to make judgments about, but you still know how your school has fared against the national average, and therefore I think it's important for us. Don't want to get into a maths lesson at the bottom here, just in case there are any statisticians on the call who are far more able to do this than I am. But basically, the confidence interval is telling you, in relation to that score, is that, and again, this links to John's point about is it statistically significant, it will tell you the range of statistical significance. So you can see for the reading score, which is the one on the right, sorry, the one on the left, I do apologize. The confidence interval there is from minus 2.3 to 0.5. This school's figure or score is at minus 0.9. Therefore, it is within that band that's defined as the confidence interval, which means that we can be, I believe, from a statistical perspective, 95% confident that that's an accurate and reliable score. So we then go down, and again, for those of you who are visual learners, this is a much nicer chart to actually look at, I guess. Color coding is not been matched with Governors for Schools livery here. This is the color coding that the DFE used by coincidence, but you will always see your own school when you're looking at these tables depicted in this bright pink color. There is a local authority average. So even if you're an academy, your school still is geographically within a local authority area, and you will still have that local comparison. And then you've got the average for the whole of the country. And you can see there's some interesting data here. Again, caveat is it's not 2019 data, so we can't rely too much on that. But what you can see is a similar way in which the data is laid out. So you've got top left bar chart is the same as we looked at for the national figure. Those pupils meeting the expected standard in the 3 subjects of reading, writing, and maths. Schools slightly below the local authority, and local authority slightly higher than the average for the country. Next to that, you've got the higher standard, and you see the schools bang in line with both the local authority and the national average. There are 11 on all 3. Average scores in reading and average scores in maths. And again, that's very similar data, so the school is more or less in line. And I can see there's a couple of questions on the panel here. Naomi's asking, why is there no data for 2020 through to 2022 on most schools? Because of the pandemic. Certainly in 20 and 21, SATs weren't sat anyway. Last year they were taken, but the government decided not to publish any school level data for primary schools. Slightly different picture for secondary schools. Mikey is actually asking, is there a chance that the school's data will not be found, and what do you do in such a situation? No, if your data is a state-funded school, i.e. maintained or academy, it is a statutory requirement that you submit your data, so it must be found. And if you don't submit your data, your school would have the weight of the DFE on it fairly rapidly. I have no doubt whatsoever, Mikey, so I hope that answers your question. Okay, let's move forward at that stage. So I'm mindful the clock is ticking by. So again, same school, we're just drilling down into a little bit more detail here. Once you have the headline data, you are then able to analyze that by a whole range of characteristics. And you can see those detailed on this slide here. We can look at disadvantaged pupils, as we said before, those attracting pupil premium, prior attainment. So this is key stage 2 school that we're looking at, or it's through primary, but obviously we're looking at data for the end of key stage 2. So the prior attainment measure will be end of key stage 1 SATs for these children. We're looking at those youngsters who've got English as additional language. There is the gender split at the bottom there, and then, sorry, not at the bottom, one up from the bottom, I should say, and then the bottom one, non-mobile pupils, refers to those children who, when they took their SATs tests, had been in the school, in this case, in Five Elms Primary in Dagenham, for the whole of Year 5 and Year 6. And the idea of that is that the government believes that if you've been there for the whole of Year 5 and Year 6, you have had the advantage of, if you like, a consistent diet of hopefully good quality teaching in that school, and therefore it's a fair comparison to make. NASA has put a question on the panel: how do governors get access to the inspection data summary report through your school, Natalie? That is something that is not in the public domain for obvious reasons, but schools should be sharing that. And those have come out in the last couple of weeks. So if you haven't had it yet, you might get it at the next meeting. If you don't, ask the question. It's a good one to ask, I would suggest. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually click on the gender one and see, you can look at any of these, but I've just picked gender as an example for you. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that you get that drop-down menu comes out. And so the plus sign on the right-hand side there has changed into a minus, just so that it recognizes it's now open. You can close it if you wish to. And you can see that you've got data going down into a lot more detail here, starting the most obvious one, of course, the number of pupils at the end of Key Stage 2. Obviously, that is Year 6. So, but Year 6 in this school, and again, bear in mind, this goes back to 2019, but it will be updated next week. So back in 2019, they had 84 pupils in the year group. So this suggests it was a three form entry school. And of those 84, 39 were girls and 45 were boys. Slight imbalance there. Now, I think as a boy, I'm allowed to say this, without wishing to be genderist in any way. As a generalization, boys tend not to perform as well as girls. So the reason we would want to look at gender is certainly as a first level investigation to find out and to know as governors, well, how does this impact on perhaps what our expectations might be moving forward? But here we've got actual numbers, and then we're looking at performance of boys versus girls, and can compare that if we wish to against all pupils, of course. So similar data analysis here on the other charts. Progress score in reading, progress score in writing, progress score in maths. And again, what the progress score means, the score basically is how does your school score against other schools? So this is based on a national average. And again, it's about how far you are from the number one. So minus 0.9 for all pupils in the school for the reading school, which is the second line down. Girls, 0.0, so that means their score was 1. So they were bang on in line with the national average. And boys, I hate to say this, but this is that self-fulfilling prophecy, of course. Boys don't perform as well as girls, so people say, and certainly the boys in this school didn't. Now, that's not an absolute statement, of course, because what we then want to do is actually perhaps look at things like the incidence of disadvantage for those pupils, the incidence of special educational needs, and it may well be there were more disadvantaged boys, there were more boys with special needs than there were girls. And I think the key point for me is data does not provide the answers. Data fuels our questions as governors, and that's the way we should always look at these data sets. Similar for writing, similar for maths, but look at the boys' performance in maths. Boys got 2.4, and again, you can see that's still within that confidence limit. So I'm looking at the far right number here. Boys score, sorry, I should say, in maths is 2.4. Girls is 1.2, so the overall is 1.8. But again, the confidence limits are quite wide on that boys' score, 0.7 up to 4.0, so it's well within that, so it's one that we can have confidence in. Higher standard across all three subjects. Again, boys not performing anywhere near as well as girls there and dragging the overall figure down. But again, we need to contextualize that. And similarly, at the bottom, pupils achieving that higher standard. Again, we knew that was 11 anyway. My guess is there's some delicate rounding up or rounding down here, because although it's 10, 11, it still ends up being rounded to 11 for the girls. But that's just to give you an indication of the sort of detail that you can drill down in. And of course, as governors, our overall aim here is to ensure that our schools are meeting the needs of all pupils. And it's important for us to actually bear in mind that in order to do that, we need to look at outcomes. And as I say, for me, that then ends up with us having more ammunition, more fuel for the questions that we might actually ask. So there's a few questions that we've got on the panel at the moment. Peter's asking, does the table show a level of change in progress in score? You said the former table says the latter. Progress is always over time. So yes, it's a measure of change. But of course, the start point is always prior attainment. So what these scores on this page are actually looking at, Peter, is what did this child actually get at the end of Key Stage 1 in terms of their SATs in reading, writing and maths? What do they get at Key Stage 2? Let's look at that on a national basis, and let's analyse where the children in this school, Five Elms School, where their overall score as a school compares with the national average. So it is a measure of progress over time, absolutely. I can see there's a question from David here. Because our school's local authority covers a very wide range of demographics, we're keen to look at data compared to local families at schools. Is there any way we can get this from gov.uk? Yeah, you can. You can actually search. If you remember going back to that search button, I see you can search by name, you can search by local authority, or you can actually search by postcode. So if you wanted to set a 5-mile radius or a 10-mile radius, or you can even do it by individual schools. It takes a little more time to do it by individual schools, but yes, that is entirely possible. Then Roy is asking, is there a national or local breakdown for pupil premium pupils? Yes, that's the disadvantaged one. I'm not actually looking at that this morning, unfortunately, Roy, but it is certainly there. Similarly, Alina is asking about SEND pupils. Yes, that's in the chart as well. And of course, this is just a start point. We can look at this data ourselves, caveat being it's currently still 2019. But of course, once the data comes out, that gives us the opportunity to update it with this year's data, but also then to think about the questions that might generate for us at school level. Okay, let's move on there. So in terms of our role as governors, I think it's important to think, while some of us might be interested in data for its own sake, we have to think about how does this sit alongside our role? And with everything, it's about governance being a strategic pursuit as opposed to operational. So it's not for us to crunch the data. It's not for us to deep dive analyze it in any way, shape or form, but it's for us to understand what those individual data sets say about our school. So I've taken here a quote from the governance handbook. It comes under section 3, which is all about accountability, and section 3.3, of course, is about our accountability for educational performance. And just want to highlight this first paragraph here, where it's talking about pupil performance. Effective boards hold their executive leaders, that means head teachers, of course, to account for improving pupil and staff performance by asking the right questions. It's essential that boards use and are familiar with specific data about their schools to help inform these questions. And then it goes on to give some examples of questions. But this is actually the crux of what today's session is all about. We have to know the data exists. We have to have a strategic overview of that data in terms of understanding the key messages there. And then we actually use that to fuel those questions, which of course is what I said right from the top. And I think a good way of thinking about this, and when I do training for clerks to governing bodies, I often suggest this as a strategy for clerks as well, who often find it quite difficult to minute a meeting when data is actually being talked about. Have a word with the head teacher beforehand and say, well, what are the 3 key messages that you want us to take away from this data? And maybe that's the way that head teachers can summarize it to the end. There is lots and lots of data available to schools. And what we want to do is make sure we don't drown in that data. But what we do need to take away from it is that clear understanding that the 3 key messages that we take from this year's data might be that actually boys are doing exceptionally well in maths. What more do we need to actually support girls? Just thinking specifically about that data that we've just looked at from Five Elms. It might be that the data, including early years data, says that we've got a very low proportion of children who achieved a good level of development in early years last year. Therefore, one of the key messages we take away is what additional intervention are we going to put in place for those children now they're in year 1, so that hopefully they perform well in the phonics check this year, but they're supported and hopefully enabled to make better progress when it comes to end of Key Stage 1 SATs next year. Okay, so just wanted to think more. It's not just that public facing data that we've got. There is lots of other data that we have available to us in our schools that you have available for you in your school. So prior attainment, you will have that, and hopefully you'll have that, depending on mobility of pupils, of course. You will have that for all of those children in your school if they've been there for that full period of time. And don't forget early years data. EYFS is early years foundation stage. We need to look at that data. Ofsted look at it when they come in, and if we don't know about it as governors, that's a bit of an own goal, to actually say the least. So we need to look at prior attainment from early years foundation stage. If you're through primary school, you need to look at your Key Stage 1 data. We also, of course, have ongoing teacher assessment. And over the last 3-4 years where we haven't had national data, that's been the only source of data available to governors. And a lot of schools have found themselves in quite difficult situations because they haven't actually asked and they haven't been provided with teacher assessment data. And of course, now that includes some outcomes for 2023, but we should be looking at assessment data, not just for those, what I call key punctuation points in children's school careers. So early years, phonics check, end of Key Stage 1, tables check in year 4, and so on. What we should be saying is, how as governors do we know, how are we assured that children and young people are making progress every year in school? And so we should be looking at assessment data. So for example, if 3 years ago we had perhaps lower than expected good level of development scores for children in reception, those children now are actually in year 3. How did they do in their SATs last year? Are they still below expectation? If so, as governors, we should be asking, so what more could we do? What are we actually putting in place to support those children? And then, of course, we come into the contextual factors germane to our own schools. And there's a whole host of these. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but some of the factors, and perhaps some of the most common ones, which many of us would find in our schools, the gender splits of the boy-girl bit, special educational needs, and 1 or 2 of you have already mentioned that, disadvantages, of course, and any other groups that perhaps might actually be significant in your own school setting. I can see, so a quick question from Sally on the panel here. Can you see comparison with reception baseline? And is this comparison available, showing which pupils have been at the school throughout year 6? Not yet is the answer there, Sally. Baseline assessment hasn't actually been in place long enough yet. And of course, because of the interruption of no SATs for the last couple of years, that may have an impact as well. But that is supposed to come on stream, I believe, in 2026. But I'll double check that. If I'm wrong, I'll get back to you. But At the same time, of course, Key Stage 1 isn't directly comparable to early years because it's a totally different curriculum. So true prior attainment really only starts at Key Stage 1, but what early years data does is flag up where perhaps there might be some general areas that should inform intervention that carries on from there, but we don't have that full level of information available to us yet, I'm afraid. Rob is saying is similar level of data available for Key Stage 1. It is, Rob, but obviously with the exception there that you don't have prior attainment data because, as I say, early years data is not comparable, so you can't really use that as prior attainment. And then the bottom bullet point on this slide, of course, local authorities do, most of them, not all, but most of them do collect and collate data, actually specifically on early years as an example. So I think what we need to actually check is, does my school receive data from the local authority? Because again, that will actually facilitate more local comparison. And I can see there's a question here from Xavier. Sorry, Xavier, this relates to one of the previous slides. Just to check, where girls' reading progress score shows 0.0, this is saying actually that there was progress and this was in line with the national average. Yes, absolutely. It's not a measure of progress, it's a progress score. So it's saying these girls made progress, but the progress made for the girls in this school was bang on 100% in line with the national average. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I wanted to just spend a few moments thinking about what lies behind the data, because as I say, I firmly do believe, my line, that data does not provide answers. Data actually fuels and inspires. Inspires questions. And I think what we need to think about in terms of what lies behind that data, first and foremost, is individual stories. Every point on a graph, every element of a bar chart actually represents an individual child. And I think it's really important for us never to lose sight of that. The other point, of course, is that children this year aren't the same children last year. So to make year-on-year comparisons is also, not terribly helpful. Might sort of give you a general direction of travel if there is such a thing in children's education, but it is important to recognize that there will be individual stories. There will be individual stories about why some children did particularly well, and conversely, why some children perhaps didn't. And it's important, not that as governors we actually interrogate those stories on a named child basis, that's never appropriate, but there will be factors. Illness continues to be a factor, so lots of children still having childhood illnesses, and COVID still going around. It's actually hit a bit of a spike in schools near me this week. One of the legacy issues from the pandemic, of course, is heightened anxiety and mental health concerns for children. And both of those two previous factors, illness and the mental health concerns, have had quite a dramatic impact in some schools with regard to attendance. And of course, that age-old adage, if you're not here, you're probably not learning, is absolutely true. So children who are not in school, children who are not attending, that's going to most likely have an impact on their performance in SATs and therefore on the school's overall performance data. So we can't look at any of this in isolation. And we had a question earlier about the attendance data. Make sure that your school is looking at the latest attendance data and make sure you understand the context of that and how that may well have had an impact on performance data this year. And then at the bottom there, I've actually put staffing issues. And some of you may think it's strange for me to put that, but I think it is possible for us to actually correlate, lots of pupil performance with related staffing issues. There may have been bouts of staff illness. There are, we know, huge recruitment and retention issues in many, many schools up and down the country. And particularly, one of the schools I'm chair at is a very large secondary academy with very nearly 2,000 pupils. we have a real shortage of English teachers at the moment. We can't recruit them for love nor money. One of our real concerns is that that could have an impact on English schools because we haven't got the quality of teachers we might otherwise want, because we've got gaps. And it means that the talent that you have got teacher-wise and the quality of that teaching is being spread incredibly thinly. Now, hopefully, it won't have an issue, but it might. And the same might be true in primary schools where perhaps we've got high staff turnover, people leaving the profession, etc. And we are running with vacancies that can only be filled by supply cover. That can have an impact. And it's just a question, again, this is all about context of our individual schools, and we shouldn't actually overlook that. I can see that there's a question from Nikki on the panel. Sorry, Karen, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong line. Karen is saying, is it possible to view the scores against the independent sector? No, it isn't, because the independent sector don't consistently use SATS tests, so we're not measuring against the same thing. And independent schools, the data that they produce, some will produce data, but of course, by their very nature, we're not comparing like with like. They're very often selecting the children and young people that are actually going into their schools. Samarthi is actually asking, are there any plans to include science? No, science is quoted. Some schools are taken in for data analysis on science at the end of Key Stage 2, but no, I don't think there are any plans to actually. It's not a test. It's not a subject that's tested at this stage, and certainly neither the government nor the Labour Party have actually indicated that there's any plans there. Okay. Just before we finished, and again, we'll come back to any other questions, I just wanted to leave one final thought with you, if I may. And that final thought comes back to a theme that I've sort of been developing as we've gone through this session this morning, and that's about the purpose of data. Some people do get excited by data, I know, and that's all well and good, but actually our role as governors isn't about the data's own sake. So we should never go away from having looked at school data saying, well, that was interesting. If we're saying it's interesting, we may be overlooking the fact that how we're going to use it. So we should always be able to say about the data, that's useful data. And the data is useful because it fuels our questions and it enables us to actually get responses to those questions, which hopefully are edifying, but hopefully actually increase the collective knowledge of the governing body. And that's really crucial, I would suggest. So now is the time if you have any other questions, but there are quite a few on the panel, so I do apologise if I haven't actually got to your question yet. If there are any that I don't manage to get to, I will get back to you individually after the session. Janice is asking, is actually saying, I can't see the disadvantage gap for my individual school. I understand this will be a small or very small sample for schools, but how can we calculate the equivalent for a specific school based on the data provided for disadvantaged pupils? Well, I think for me, Janice, it's a recognition that actually, were there to be a score for your school, it would probably be unfair because of the sample size. So I think what you have to do is actually get the school, and again, in many schools where we're talking about small numbers of pupils, perhaps in specific groups, etc., look at a little mini case study. Again, I'm not suggesting we go on a huge bureaucratic trail on this. That's not sensible. But ask your school, well, have we got examples of where our disadvantaged pupils did make good progress or perhaps didn't, and to look at the factors that actually influence that. The national data is a guide. It's based on results from every single school in the country, and there's an awful lot of them. Drawing that comparison, because of all those contextual factors, isn't always going to be that realistic, I would suggest. So talk about it at school level. Talk about what happened with the children in your school. That's always going to be more relevant, would be my advice. Catherine said, I agree about staffing. I govern. I'm sorry, I've actually lost the. Sorry, I've got so many questions popping up. It's a bit like the one-armed bandit spinning around at the moment. I'm sorry, Catherine, I was actually going to read yours out. This seems to have actually disappeared. Is it possible, Peter, saying on the DFE website to see aggregated data from Multi-Academy Trust? Yes, it is, Peter. If you go back to my, I think it was fourth or fifth slide, but that slide where it showed they get school and college performance, one of the options is schools, and the next one is maths, so you can actually get whole maths data as well. Again, I haven't looked at that recently, but of course it won't have changed. But whether it's going to change this year, you have to do that individually. It will only give you one math, and it splits it by phase, of course. So some maths are cross-phase, secondary and primary. A question from Ryan here. Ryan saying, while we can question the data, taking into account what lies behind the data, as our role as governors is to ensure that we feel comfortable that the head teacher and staff are able to identify trends and find areas and spaces to correct. However, with limited budgets for schools are working with, how can schools communicate with governors that they are taking the steps possible? I think that's a fair point, Ryan. I think, finance is context, and I don't need to be dismissive by saying that, but finance is contextual, and therefore we do still seek assurance that our schools are doing everything possible with the constraint of finance that we know about. So within our limited budgets, what are we doing? And it might be about staff deployment, it might be about using volunteers, but schools are still expected, and again, we're not naive enough to actually think that funding issues don't cause problems, but schools are still expected to produce the best possible learning outcomes, the best possible care outcomes for pupils. And I think our role as governors is about ensuring, and again, the caveat may very well be within our means, but ensuring that schools are doing that we are stretching pupils, that we are enabling them to make the maximum amount of progress. I hope that answers your question, Ryan. Val is saying, if, as a very broad assessment referred to you by earlier, boys tend to make lesser progress than girls, should we be asking about what focus boys are receiving from the beginning? Absolutely, Val, we really should. And lots of schools have done a lot of work, so we're not starting from ground zero here. I don't think it's worth thinking about. A lot of research has been done into the progress that boys make in schools in this country, and lots of schools have made significant changes to their curriculum in terms of perhaps some of the reading texts that are being used, to the way in which they've perhaps designed their timetable, the way in which boys are encouraged to write in extended ways in other subjects, etc., because boys' writing historically has been one of the key areas of concern. So certainly we should be asking that question, but we should also be, as I say, understanding our context. Just because you've got, for example, 65% boys and 35% girls, it doesn't mean that your results are going to be a disappointment this year. It may well be some of those boys are very bright, because there are individuals that buck the trend. The important thing for us as governors is to say, understand the context, and then comes the so what question. And please don't ever say just so what on its own. No, that's very bad advice, because it's actually quite rude. But so what are we going to do about it? So what additional interventions will we put in place to support boys? Those are great questions. They're exactly the kind of questions as governors we should be asking, in my view. Karen is asking, with your academy role, how much influence does the local forums have on challenging data with good effect? And as now in a trust, the head teacher and her teams are more accountable for delivery to the CEO and SLT. I get that, Karen, at local level, but again, it will depend on the scheme of delegation you have in your multi-academy trust. But most local governing boards, local forums, local governor committees, whatever they're called, their key responsibility is about holding the school to account for performance, and that is pupil and staff performance, of course. So My personal view is it doesn't change. Yes, in an academy trust, the head teacher is also accountable to the CEO, but that's no different from a local authority where the head teacher of the school is accountable to the local authority and the school improvement team there. So it's just, it's a different person that accountability is being directed to, but I don't think the process is any different. So I think it's still equally relevant. Bruce is asking, what other good sources of summary guidance for governors are there to help us in our analysis of and use of school performance data in our role of questioning and challenging school executive teams? I'm not sure there's much out there in terms of there are lots of people. I mean, a Better Governor, we do lots of training on asking the right questions. We do a session on asking the right questions purely on performance data. But again, the art of questioning is not it's not a dark art at all. It really isn't. It's about common sense. And I would always say start when you're thinking about questions to ask as governors on the premise of, well, actually, if this was me, if I was a child in this data, what are the questions that I should be asking? Okay, most children at that time don't know what the questions are, but as adults, we have that benefit. So if we've got, for example, children with special educational needs in our school, consistently not making as much progress. And again, I'm not talking about attainment here, I'm talking about progress, not making as much progress. We should be asking, if I was one of those children with special educational needs, well, why aren't I making as much progress as everybody else? And that leads to another question, which says, well, what support do we provide for our special needs children in those lessons where we want them to make particular progress? And I'm thinking about reading here as that access subject to the rest of the curriculum. And we're building questions. They're simple questions, but the answers might be slightly more complex. But the answer to every question is very often the fuel for the next one. It's a little bit like peeling back the onion, I always say. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question there, Bruce. I'm just mindful of the time, but just two more questions, if I may. Donald saying, are there any single-sex schools in England now? Absolutely, there are. I'm sure we will have some governors in the audience this morning who probably govern single-sex schools. They're not that unusual. I mean, they're absolutely a minority of them, but here in Surrey, there are two where I live, there are two that immediately spring to mind, both secondary. But nonetheless, yes, there are still single-sex schools around. Sue is actually making a comment. Good schools have monitoring and evaluation systems, usually related to school development plan priorities, in place to identify gaps in teaching and learning. At my school last night, we had a presentation telling us about changes which have been introduced. Yeah, that's great, Sue. And I think that's exactly what, as governors, we should be able to do, is to connect those monitoring processes and systems in our school, because they are actually fueling our questions, or some of them maybe going some way to answering our questions about, well, this data says this, what are the barriers there? The school should be in a position to tell you what those barriers are and should be able to then explain what the school is doing to overcome them. And again, something to think about coming up if you've not already had this meeting, but at a meeting fairly soon, either now or just after the Christmas break, schools, or governors rather, I should say, will be hopefully presented with the pupil premium strategy that has to be updated at the end of the year. Pupil premium strategy should be a response, not least of all, to the data that we get. And we don't always think about connecting all of these various bits. So I think Sue's point is a very valid one. Think about all of the information, all of the data that we have available as governors, and are we joining up the dots? Are we making sure that we are consistently thinking about those messages? Because say for me, it's not what the data itself says in terms of absolute numbers, it's what those key messages are. So what are those three things that governors take away from this year's round of data analysis of the school, and what are those three priorities? Okay, well, at that stage, ladies and gentlemen, we are nearly there. So just wanted to actually point out to you, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the three key areas that I've actually talked to in terms of DfE guidance. I've given you the URLs for those there. They will be updated next week. Whether it happens by 9:30 on Thursday morning or not, I'm not quite sure, but keep an eye on those. When you get the slides, all of these URLs will be there. And that just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for joining this session this morning. I hope you found it useful. Please do come back for more Governance for Schools webinars after the Christmas holidays. I think this is the last one this term now. And above all else, of course, enjoy the rest of your day today. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.